I'm Ethan, I'm 23, and my parents used my graduation party money to fund my brother's luxury trip to Europe. When I confronted them, my own father screamed in my face that I was selfish and that there would be no celebration. He didn't know it then, but that single act of cruelty set in motion a chain of events that would cost them their company, their reputation, and their $5 million inheritance. Before I tell you how I uncovered their ultimate betrayal and took back everything they tried to steal, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's go back 3 months, to a time that felt simpler, a time filled with a hope I hadn't realized was so fragile. I was on top of the world. Westlake University's ivy-covered walls had been my home for 4 years, and I was about to walk away with a finance degree, magna cum laude. My final thesis on emerging market trends had just won a departmental award. My mentor, Professor Martinez, was already talking to me about prestigious internships, dropping names like Goldman Sachs. For the first time, I felt like my future was a tangible thing, a solid structure I had built with my own 2 hands, brick by painful brick. The air in my shared campus apartment was thick with the smell of cheap pizza and the nervous energy of finals week. My roommate, Derek, was sprawled on the couch, highlighting a textbook with a ferocity that suggested he was trying to absorb it by sheer force of will. "You're actually done, man," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "You're free." A strange lightness filled my chest. I leaned back in my worn-out desk chair, the one with a permanent squeak, and allowed myself a small, genuine smile. The hard part was over. Now came the celebration. My grandfather, William, had made sure of that. A week earlier, he'd called me, his voice a familiar, comforting rumble over the phone. "Ethan, my boy," he'd said, "I've sent your parents a check, $8,000. That's for your party, and don't let them tell you otherwise. You've earned it." $8,000. It was an absurd amount of money for a party, but that was my grandfather. He was a self-made man who believed in celebrating milestones with conviction. He saw his own work ethic in me, and he wasn't shy about showing his approval. So, as I packed my bags to head home, my mind was filled with images of a backyard barbecue, the chatter of friends and family, maybe a banner that said, "Congratulations, Ethan." It wasn't about the money. It was about the recognition. It was about one day, just one, where the spotlight might actually find me. I was hopeful, but a small, familiar knot of anxiety tightened in my stomach. I was heading home, back to the place where the rules were different, back to the shadow of my older brother, James. I pushed the feeling down. This time, I told myself, would be different. This time, there was a check with my name on it. To understand what happened next, you have to understand the landscape of my family. It wasn't a war zone. Not in the way you see on TV with screaming matches and slammed doors. It was quieter, more insidious. It was a kingdom where there was only one prince, and it wasn't me. My world was one of quiet dismissals, of achievements that were met with a polite nod while my brother's slightest accomplishments were trumpeted from the rooftops. My brother, James, was 5 years older, and from the moment I was born, he was the son my family orbited around. He was the high school quarterback, the charismatic one with an easy smile and a story for every occasion. He could walk into a room of strangers and walk out with a dozen new friends and a business card. My father, Robert, a successful real estate developer, saw a younger, better version of himself in James. He saw the swagger, the confidence, the kind of man who could close a deal with a handshake and a joke. My father loved the reflection he saw in James's eyes. I was different. I was the quiet one, the analytical one. My idea of a good time was losing myself in the Wall Street Journal or building complex financial models on my laptop. The intricate dance of numbers, the logic of the market, that was my sport. When my dad tried to talk to me about the steel tonnage on his latest construction project, my eyes would glaze over. But if I tried to explain the beauty of a well-balanced portfolio or the intricacies of quantitative easing, he'd clap me on the shoulder, a little too hard, and say, "That's great, son. Real great." Then he'd turn to James and ask about his golf game. It wasn't malice. It was a fundamental disconnect, a language barrier between a father and a son who were tuned to different frequencies. My mother, Diane, An interior designer with a flair for the dramatic, simply followed his lead. Her world was about appearances, social standing, and creating the perfect picture of a successful family. James was a much better accessory for that picture than I was. The favoritism wasn't in words. It was written in deeds, in milestones marked and unmarked. It was a constant, low-level hum of inequality that defined my childhood. For James's 16th birthday, a gleaming black BMW appeared in the driveway, topped with a giant red bow. My dad tossed him the keys with a proud grin. "You've earned it, champ." What he'd earned it for, I never figured out. For mine, I got a gift certificate for a defensive driving course. "Safety first, Ethan," my mom had said, patting my hand. When James graduated high school, my parents threw a party that was the talk of the neighborhood. 200 people, a catered buffet with an ice sculpture, a live band playing classic rock covers. The whole street was lined with cars. I spent most of the night refilling chip bowls, feeling like an employee at my own brother's coronation. When I graduated high school, we went out for a quiet dinner at a local steakhouse. Just the four of us. I remember sitting there, picking at my fries, while James dominated the conversation with stories about his first year in the sales department at Dad's company, and my parents hung on his every word. "James just has a natural talent for people," my dad said, beaming. I had just graduated with honors, but no one asked about my plans. It was 1,000 tiny cuts like that. They attended every corporate event James was a part of, every awards dinner where his team was recognized. But when I was inducted into the National Honor Society, they had a prior commitment with a couple from their country club. When I won my first academic scholarship, a significant one that would cover half my tuition, they missed the ceremony because James had a really important golf tournament with a potential client. They sent a text, "Congrats. So proud. See you tonight." That night, all they talked about was how James had almost gotten a hole-in-one. Even my mentor, Professor Martinez, saw it. He was a brilliant, kind man who had taken me under his wing. He'd invited my family to a departmental dinner for honors students, a prestigious event. I watched with a familiar ache as my father spent 20 minutes talking to another student's dad about a real estate deal, while my mother complimented the decor and the floral arrangements. When Professor Martinez tried to engage them about my thesis, about the complex modeling I had done, they smiled politely, nodded, and then my father said, "Speaking of business, James is about to close a huge deal for us." The kid's a natural. They steered the conversation back to their favorite topic. Later, the professor pulled me aside as we were leaving. "You have a brilliant mind, Ethan," he said. His eyes filled with a kindness I rarely saw at home. "Don't ever let anyone make you feel that's not enough. Some people can only see value when it looks just like them." So, when my grandfather, William, called about the party money, it felt like a cosmic shift. He was the only one who truly saw me. A tough, no-nonsense man who'd built his own manufacturing empire from nothing. He had no patience for my father's flash or my brother's empty charm. He valued substance, grit, and integrity. He was the only person who ever asked me to explain my passions. He'd often pull me into his home office, a room that smelled of old books and leather, and ask me to explain my investment strategies. He'd listen, really listen, asking sharp, insightful questions that challenged my assumptions. "You've got the mind for it, boy," he'd say, a rare smile touching his lips. "Your father builds with concrete and steel. You build with numbers. It's all the same in the end. It's about creating value where there was none. Never forget that." That's why he sent the check. It wasn't just for a party. It was a statement. It was his way of leveling the playing field. He called me specifically to tell me about it. $8,000, Ethan," he'd repeated, his voice firm. "I'm putting it in your parents' account, but I told them, in no uncertain terms, this is for you. For your celebration. Make sure they use it right." That phrase echoed in my head. Make sure they use it right. It gave me a flicker of agency, a sense of responsibility. This time I had a say. This time it was different. My friend Sophia, who I'd known since freshman year, was helping me draft a guest list. She was sharp, funny, and had a way of cutting through my self-doubt with a single, well-aimed question. We were sitting in the campus library, the supposed-to-be quiet space filled with the buzz of stressed-out students. "You're really going to do it? A big party?" she asked, her pen hovering over a notepad. "Grandpa's orders," I said, trying to sound casual, like this was a normal thing for me. She looked at me, her expression serious. "Good. It's about time. But Ethan, are you sure they'll do it?" Her skepticism was a mirror of my own deepest fears. "They have to," I said, more to convince myself than her. "He gave them the money specifically for it. He was very clear." "Okay," she said, drawing out the word. "Just don't get your hopes up too high. You know how they are." She paused, then tapped her pen on the table. "You know, you're going to do amazing things. You're going to be one of those guys on the cover of Forbes one day. You don't need a party to prove that." "I know," I said, my voice softer than I intended, "but it would be nice, just once, to feel like they see it too." The drive home was a blur of highways and exit signs. With every mile, the hopeful vision of a celebration grew brighter in my mind, pushing aside the years of doubt. I pictured my friends from the finance lab, Derek and the others, mingling with my family. I pictured Professor Martinez shaking my father's hand, maybe finally getting him to understand the significance of my work. I pictured myself, for once, not feeling like an outsider in my own home, not having to fight for a sliver of the spotlight. When I pulled into the long, paved driveway of their sprawling 5-bedroom house, the first prickle of unease hit me. The house looked normal, quiet, too quiet. There were no extra cars, no sign of preparations. Just the perfectly manicured lawn and the imposing oak front door that always seemed to judge you as you approached. I let myself in. The house was cool and silent. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioner and the tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall, each tick marking a second of my dwindling hope. My parents were in the living room, sitting on the plush white sofa. My father was flipping through a magazine. My mother was scrolling on her phone. They were surrounded by blueprints and fabric swatches spread across the glass coffee table, clearly in the middle of a design project. They looked up as I entered, their smiles a little too bright, a little too forced. "Ethan, you're home," my mother said, standing to give me a brief, air-light hug that barely made contact. "Hey son, good trip?" my father asked, not looking up from his magazine. There was no congratulations. No, "We're so proud of you." The air was thick with something I couldn't name, a tension that coiled in the pit of my stomach. This was the moment. I took a breath, my heart starting to pound. "It was fine," I said, setting my bags down. The sound echoed in the silence. "So, is everything ready for Saturday?" My mother's smile faltered. She glanced at my father, a silent, panicked conversation passing between them in a fraction of a second. My father sighed, a sound of pure annoyance, finally closing his magazine and placing it on the table with a soft thud. He looked at me, his expression a mixture of irritation and discomfort. The perfect, hopeful image in my mind began to crack, splintering into a million pieces. And in that moment I knew before they even said a word. The kingdom was still a kingdom, and the prince was still the prince. And I was just the court jester who had foolishly mistaken the king's spare change for a crown. The silence in that living room stretched for what felt like an eternity. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, filled with everything they weren't saying. My mother busied herself by rearranging the fabric swatches on the table, her movements jerky and unnatural, her focus intense as if the fate of the world depended on the placement of a piece of silk. My father cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud. "About that, Ethan," he began, his voice taking on that tone he always used before delivering bad news, a forced, placating calm that was far more infuriating than outright anger. "We need to talk about the party." "What's there to talk about?" I asked, my own voice sounding hollow in my ears. The knot of anxiety in my stomach was now a block of ice. "It's in 2 days. Did you send out the invitations I emailed you?" I spent hours on that list. My mother flinched as if I'd struck her. My father's jaw tightened, a small muscle twitching in his cheek. "Listen," he said, leaning forward. his hands clasped together on the glass table. An opportunity came up for James. A really big one. A once-in-a-lifetime kind of thing. I felt a cold dread wash over me. I knew where this was going. Every story in our family, no matter where it started, always ended with James. It was the unwritten rule of our lives. He had a chance to go to Europe, my father continued, his voice gaining momentum as he slipped into his familiar salesman pitch, the one he used on reluctant clients. Paris, Milan, a couple of days in London. He's meeting with some very important investors for the new waterfront project. This could be the deal that sets him up for life, son. It's a huge step for his career, for the company. Okay, I said slowly, my mind refusing to connect the dots. Even though the picture was brutally, blindingly clear. What does James's trip to Europe have to do with my graduation party? My mother finally looked at me, her eyes pleading, begging me to understand without her having to say the words. The money, honey, she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. The trip was very last minute and it was expensive. The flights, the hotels, it all added up. We had to make a choice. The floor seemed to drop out from under me. A choice, I repeated, the words catching in my throat. You made a choice? Grandpa gave you that money for one reason. He told me it was for my party. I could hear my own voice rising, trembling with a mixture of disbelief and rage. William doesn't understand the pressures of modern business. My father snapped, his patience finally breaking. The placating tone was gone, replaced by a sharp, defensive edge. He sits in his big house, counting money he made 30 years ago. He doesn't get it. This wasn't a vacation, Ethan. This was an investment. An investment in your brother's future, in this family's future. And my graduation isn't? I shot back, a surge of long-suppressed anger finally bubbling to the surface. 4 years of working my tail off, a 3.9 GPA, an honors degree in finance. That's not an investment? That's just a hobby. Oh, don't be so dramatic, my mother said, waving a dismissive hand, as if shooing away a fly. It's just a party. We can go out for a nice dinner just like we did for high school. We'll go to that steakhouse you like. Just like high school. The words hung in the air, a perfect crystallization of my entire life. I would always be the quiet dinner, the polite afterthought, while James was the catered affair with the live band. As if on cue, the man himself walked in. James strolled into the living room, looking tanned and relaxed, radiating an aura of effortless success. He was wearing a new, ridiculously expensive-looking designer shirt and holding his phone, a smug grin on his face. Hey, little brother, you're back, he said with that easy charm of his. He didn't seem to notice the suffocating tension in the room. Or maybe he just didn't care. You've got to see this. The view from my hotel in Paris was insane. He swiped through photos on his phone, shoving it in my face. Pictures of himself posing in front of the Eiffel Tower, holding a glass of champagne on a balcony, a close-up of his first-class airline ticket. First class is the only way to fly, man. Seriously. Seeing him there, so oblivious, so unapologetically entitled, something inside me broke. The years of quiet resentment, of swallowing my disappointment, erupted. You used my money? I said, my voice low and shaking with a rage I hadn't known I was capable of. You took money that was meant for me, for my accomplishment, and you spent it on a luxury vacation. James finally looked up, his smile fading, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. Whoa, hey, it was a business trip, and Dad gave me the money. Take it up with him. It wasn't his to give. I yelled, my voice cracking. It was a gift. To me. The one time something was actually for me. That's when my father exploded. He shot up from the couch, his face turning a dark, mottled red. He pointed a finger at me, his whole body trembling with fury. That's enough, he roared, his voice bouncing off the high ceilings. I am sick and tired of your whining. Your brother is out there building a future, hustling, making connections, and you're here crying about a stupid party. You are just selfish. That's all you've ever been. Always in your books. always in your own little world, never thinking about this family. Well, you know what? Fine. There won't be any celebrations. No party, no dinner, nothing. Are you happy now? The word selfish hit me like a physical blow. Me, the one who never asked for anything. The one who took the smaller room, the older car, the quieter celebration. The one who just wanted one day. Selfish. The accusation was so absurd, so profoundly unjust, that it stole the breath from my lungs. My mother, seeing the look on my face, tried to soften the blow, but only managed to twist the knife deeper. "Ethan, your father is just stressed," she said. "The waterfront project is a lot of pressure. Besides, it's for the best. We already called everyone and told them it was canceled." "You what?" I whispered, the words barely audible. "We told them you were just too stressed out after finals," she said, avoiding my eyes, suddenly fascinated by a loose thread on a cushion. "That you were feeling a bit overwhelmed and needed some quiet time. That you were having some emotional problems." Emotional problems. They hadn't just taken my party. They had taken my reputation. They had painted me as unstable, as weak, to my friends, to my professors, to the people whose respect I had worked so hard to earn. It was a lie. A cruel, calculated lie designed to protect them, to make their selfish decisions seem like an act of compassion. I stared at them, the three of them standing there, a united front of betrayal. There was nothing left to say. The anger drained out of me, replaced by a profound, chilling emptiness. I turned without another word, picked up my bags, and walked towards the door. "Where are you going?" my father demanded, his voice still laced with anger. "Don't you walk away when I'm talking to you." The disrespect. I didn't answer. I just kept walking. My hand was on the doorknob when it turned from the other side. The oak door swung open, and my grandfather, William, stood on the threshold. He was holding a beautifully wrapped gift, a smile on his face. "Ethan, I was hoping I'd catch you." His smile vanished the second he saw my face. His sharp eyes darted from me to my parents, to the tense, toxic silence in the room. He took in my bags clutched in my white-knuckled grip, my pale face, the furious expression on my father's. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Where are the decorations? I thought there was a party to prepare for." No one spoke. The truth was a grenade in the center of the room, and no one wanted to be the one to pull the pin. But my grandfather's gaze was relentless. It settled on my father. "Robert, what did you do?" My father stammered, trying to piece together a justification about business and investments, but my grandfather cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand. He looked back at me, and in his eyes, I saw not pity, but a reflection of my own cold fury. He didn't need to hear the details. He already knew. He set the gift down on the entryway table. "Ethan," he said, his voice calm and steady, a rock in the middle of my swirling chaos. "Go get the rest of your things. You're coming with me." My father started to protest. "Now, wait a minute, Dad. You can't just—" "I can," my grandfather said, his voice like steel. He didn't raise it, but it cut through my father's blustering with absolute authority. He turned his back on my parents, his dismissal of them more profound than any insult. He looked only at me. "Ethan, let's go." I didn't hesitate. I walked back past my stunned family, went up to the guest room that was supposed to be my childhood bedroom, and packed the rest of my belongings. Each item I threw in my bag was a final, decisive act. As I walked out of that house for what I knew would be the last time as a son, I didn't look back. I didn't have to. I knew that something fundamental had broken. It wasn't just my heart. It was the entire foundation of my family. And in that moment of pure, unadulterated rage, I had a single clarifying thought. They were going to regret this. The drive to my grandfather's lake house was silent. I stared out the window, watching the manicured lawns of my parents' neighborhood give way to the winding country roads that led to his property. The chaos in my mind was a raging sea, but my grandfather's presence next to me was a steady, unshakable lighthouse. He didn't offer empty platitudes or tell me it would be okay. He didn't ask questions. He just drove, giving me the space to breathe, to let the initial shock subside and harden into resolve. His house was my sanctuary, a sprawling log and stone structure overlooking the calm, gray waters of Lake Travis. It was the complete opposite of my parents' sterile, modern mansion. Their house was a showcase. His was a home. It was filled with old books, worn leather armchairs, and the smell of a wood-burning fireplace, even in the summer. It felt like home in a way my actual house never had. The first thing he did was pick up the phone. He didn't ask my permission. He just acted with the swift efficiency of a man used to command. He called a local catering company he knew well and ordered an obscene amount of food for the coming Saturday. "The best of everything, Tom," I heard him say. "We're celebrating an important achievement." Then he asked for my phone. I handed it over without a word. He started going through my contacts, calling my friends one by one. "Derek? This is Ethan's grandfather, William," I heard him say, his voice firm but warm. "There's been a change of plans. The party is on, but the venue has been upgraded. I'm texting you the address to my lake house. Spread the word. Tell everyone it's a lake party." He even called Professor Martinez, who sounded genuinely delighted to hear from him. Sophia drove 3 hours to be there, bringing Derek and a carload of our friends from the finance lab. That Saturday, the deck of my grandfather's house was filled with the people who actually saw me, who respected me. They didn't know the whole story, only that there had been a family mix-up. It didn't matter. They were there for me. The sound of their laughter, the genuine congratulations, the easy camaraderie. It was a bomb on a very raw wound. My grandfather, holding a glass of iced tea, raised it for a toast. "To Ethan," he said, his voice carrying across the deck. "A young man of integrity, intelligence, and character. He is a testament to the fact that true value isn't inherited. It's built. I'm proud of you, son." Tears pricked my eyes. It was everything I had ever wanted to hear from my own father. That night, after everyone had left, my grandfather and I sat by the lake. The water was a sheet of black glass, reflecting the stars. It was then that he opened up his world to me, explaining the financial realities I had never been privy to. "You need to understand something, Ethan," he said, his voice serious. "Your father, he's a good builder, but a terrible businessman. He's a gambler who mistakes luck for skill. For the last 10 years, I've been his safety net. Most of his big projects, the ones he's so proud of, were only possible because my company quietly co-signed on the loans, providing the financial guarantee the banks needed." I was stunned. My father had always projected an image of invincible success, of a man who bent the world to his will. "He doesn't know the details," my grandfather continued, "but he knows there's a safety net. It's made him reckless. This new waterfront project, it's his biggest gamble yet, and he's in over his head. He needed that money for James's trip, not for business, but to wine and dine investors because the project is bleeding cash." The next morning, while I was still asleep, my grandfather made another set of calls. These were not to friends or caterers. They were to his lawyers and his bank. He calmly, methodically, and ruthlessly dismantled the safety net. He rescinded his company's guarantees on all of my father's active loans. He canceled the company credit card he had given James, the one James was using to finance his business trip. He froze the personal line of credit he had extended to my parents for emergencies. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. The first call came from James. He was screaming, his voice a high-pitched whine of panic. "Fix this now," he shrieked over the phone at me, after I was woken up by the ringing. "My hotel just declined my card. They're threatening to call the police." "What did you say to Grandpa?" "I didn't say anything, James," I said, my voice cold. "I didn't have to." I hung up. Then came the calls from my parents. Their credit cards were being declined at the high-end boutiques they frequented. But it was worse than that. My father's phone began ringing off the hook. The bank was calling in a loan. His investors were getting nervous. The waterfront project, his crowning achievement, was suddenly on the verge of collapse because the financing had evaporated overnight. They bombarded my phone with calls and texts, a mixture of threats and pleas. But it was a voicemail from my mother that cut the deepest. It wasn't angry. It was something far worse. It was a low, weeping, manipulative torrent of words. "Ethan, how could you do this?" She sobbed into the phone. "You're destroying this family. All over a stupid party. Your father, he's a wreck. He's worked his whole life for this. And you're tearing it all down out of spite. I don't understand you. I really don't. A good son, a loving son, would never be so cruel." The words were designed to cripple me with guilt. For a moment, they almost worked. A pang of doubt shot through me. Was I being cruel? Was I destroying them? My hand trembled as I held the phone. Then I remembered my father's face, twisted in rage, calling me selfish. I remembered the casual cruelty of their lie about my emotional problems. This wasn't about a party. It was about a lifetime of being treated as less than. It was about them facing the consequences of their own actions for the first time in their lives. The trembling stopped. I blocked their numbers. All of them. My grandfather saw the turmoil on my face later that day. He didn't tell me what to do. He just opened a door. "Your father's company files are all public record, for the most part," he said casually, gesturing to his laptop. "An ambitious finance student could probably learn a lot by looking at the public filings of a struggling real estate developer. Knowledge is power, Ethan." He was giving me a weapon, a way to fight back with my own skills. For the rest of the week, I didn't just lick my wounds. I went to work. I dove into my father's business, using the analytical skills I had honed for 4 years. I sifted through financial statements, loan agreements, and project proposals. And I started to find things. Small inconsistencies at first, then larger ones. Questionable expenses. Funds moved between projects in unusual ways. And a lot of them had one name attached: James. I was no longer just a victim. I was an investigator. And I was beginning to realize that the canceled party was just the tip of a very, very large iceberg. The next 3 months were a masterclass in desperation. My father's company was in a death spiral. Without my grandfather's backing, the banks saw him for what he was: a high-risk developer with a history of over-leveraging. The waterfront project stalled, a skeleton of steel and concrete bleeding money every single day. They were forced to sell off smaller properties at a loss just to cover interest payments. The frantic calls had stopped, replaced by a tense, unnerving silence. I knew, however, that this was the calm before an even bigger storm. A wounded animal is most dangerous when it's cornered. I spent that time arming myself. Under my grandfather's guidance, I wasn't just a student anymore. I was an apprentice. He walked me through his own business, showing me the solid, conservative principles he'd used to build his empire. "Never risk what you can't afford to lose, Ethan. And never mistake ego for a business plan," he'd say. In the evenings, I continued my deep dive into my father's failing one. The picture that emerged was ugly. James hadn't just been on a business trip. He'd been living a life of absurd luxury on the company dime, expensing everything from designer clothes to gambling nights in Monaco, all disguised as client entertainment. My father had been either too blind to see it or too weak to stop it. He was funding his favorite son's lifestyle while the business crumbled. Then, just as I was beginning to think they had finally given up, the next attack came. And it came from a direction I never expected. Her name was Megan, James's girlfriend, a sleek, ambitious marketing executive. She had always treated me with a polite, dismissive indifference at family gatherings. She was firmly in James's orbit, another satellite to his sun. She found me at a coffee shop near my new campus, where I'd started a summer graduate course. She slid into the chair opposite me, a concerned look expertly painted on her face. Her perfume was expensive, her smile was flawless, and her eyes were cold. "Ethan," she said, her voice a low, confidential murmur. "I'm so worried about James." I just stared at her, my expression unreadable, and took a slow sip of my coffee. "He's not himself," she continued, leaning in, creating a bubble of false intimacy. "Your parents, they're putting so much pressure on him. They're forcing him to do things to try and fix this mess. I think they're the ones who pushed him to be so awful to you. I need an ally, Ethan. Someone on the inside to help me help him. I've always thought you were the smart one, the one who sees things clearly. It was a brilliant performance. The concerned girlfriend, the plea for an alliance, the subtle flattery. A year ago, I might have fallen for it. I might have been so desperate for any validation that I would have believed her. But now my senses were honed. I saw the lie in her eyes, the carefully rehearsed speech. She wasn't here for James. She was here for herself. She was on a reconnaissance mission. What kind of things are they forcing him to do? I asked, keeping my voice neutral, playing the part of the concerned brother she wanted to see. Oh, terrible things, she said vaguely, shaking her head and looking down at her hands as if in anguish. Legal things. Things involving doctors. It's all a mess. They're talking about your grandfather trying to manage his affairs. I'm scared they're going to drag James down with them. Doctors. The word snagged in my mind again. It was an odd, specific detail. It was bait. I decided to bite. I'm listening, I said. My feigned cooperation was all the opening they needed. That night, my phone rang. It was an unknown number. It was James. But this wasn't the panicked whining of 3 months ago. This was pure, undiluted rage. What did you say to her? He snarled, his voice tight with fury. What did you tell Megan? I didn't tell her anything, James, I said calmly, already hitting the record button on my phone. She seemed worried about you. Liar. She called me, asking all sorts of questions. You're trying to turn her against me, just like you did with Grandpa, he screamed. You're ruining everything. You're going to blow the whole plan. The plan with the doctor, the one with the lawyer. It was all to save the family, to save everything. And you're going to destroy it all because you couldn't get over a stupid party. And there it was. Not the whole story, but a crucial, damning fragment. The plan with the doctor. The one with the lawyer. He had confessed on a recorded line. I hung up the phone, my heart pounding. A cold, terrifying realization dawned on me. This had escalated far beyond money or favoritism. This was criminal. The next morning, my grandfather and I were sitting in the polished mahogany office of his lawyer. A sharp, no-nonsense woman named Ms. Chun. A doctor and a lawyer, my grandfather said, his voice grim as I played the recording for her. It can only mean one thing. Ms. Chun listened intently, her face impassive, but her eyes hardened. She typed something into her computer, her fingers flying across the keyboard. After a moment, she stopped and turned to face us. As your legal counsel, William, I'm obligated to report any inquiries that could be perceived as a conflict of interest, she said formally. 2 months ago, I received a call from a man representing himself as Robert's attorney. He was making a preliminary inquiry. He wanted to know the general legal standards and procedures required to have an individual declared mentally incompetent and to establish a conservatorship over their estate. The air left the room. It was no longer a theory. It was a fact. They had tried to have my grandfather declared mentally unfit so they could seize control of his $5 million estate and his company. It was the ultimate betrayal. The canceled party wasn't an insult. It was the catalyst for a crime. Now I had all the pieces. It was time to end the game. I arranged the meeting myself. I called my father and told him it was time to talk, to find a solution. I said it would be at my grandfather's house, a neutral ground. They agreed immediately, likely assuming my resolve had finally broken and I was coming to beg for a truce. They arrived that evening, Robert, Diane, and James. They walked into the living room with an air of cautious optimism, like generals arriving to accept a surrender. They saw me and my grandfather sitting there and took their seats on the opposite sofa. I'm glad you came, I began, my voice steady. I could feel my grandfather's presence beside me, a silent pillar of support. Well, son, it's time we put this ugliness behind us, my father said, attempting a magnanimous tone. I agree, I said. So let's be honest. Your company is insolvent, not because of me, but because of years of reckless spending and mismanagement. I have the records. I slid a thin folder across the coffee table. Like the $50,000 James charged to the company for what he called client development in Monaco, which coincided exactly with a major poker tournament. James went pale. My father's face darkened. That's a business expense. Is it? I asked calmly. Because I also have the records of you spending nearly $250,000 from the company accounts on home renovations over the past 2 years. Is the house a company asset, Dad? My mother gasped. How dare you go through our private things? They're not private when you use company funds, I replied, my voice dropping, becoming as cold as ice. I looked directly at my father. When the financial pressure mounted, you didn't try to fix the business. You tried to steal from an old man. You consulted a lawyer about having my grandfather declared mentally incompetent. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a world ending. My mother's face was a mask of horror. My father looked like he'd been struck by lightning, his mouth agape. I turned my gaze to James. You were in on it. You were so desperate you even sent your girlfriend to manipulate me, to find out what I knew. James just stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. The pressure, the guilt, the sheer terror of being caught, it was all too much. He broke. We had to, he cried, his voice cracking, tears streaming down his face. Dad was going to lose everything. It was the only way. We were just trying to protect the family. He had confessed. In front of everyone. He had admitted to the entire monstrous plan. I leaned back in my chair, the tension draining out of me. I looked at the ruins of my family across the room. There was no triumph, no joy, just a vast, empty sadness. The war was over, and I had won. The confession hung in the air, thick and poisonous. James's sobs were the only sound in the room, a pathetic, gulping noise that did nothing to earn him any sympathy. My mother looked catatonic, her hands clasped in her lap as she stared into the middle distance. Her carefully constructed world shattered around her. My father, however, was still fighting. I could see it in the stubborn set of his jaw, the flicker of defiance in his eyes. He was a cornered animal, looking for one last way out. But my grandfather gave him none. William, who had remained silent throughout my entire presentation, finally spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. The voice of a man who had built and dismantled empires smaller than this before breakfast. Here is what is going to happen, he said, addressing my father as if he were a junior employee in a boardroom. You have 2 options. Option 1, you will voluntarily sign over controlling interest of your company to a trust, which I will establish. A new management board will be appointed. Ethan will have a seat on that board as a senior analyst, where he will learn the business from the ground up. The company will be salvaged, your employees will keep their jobs, and you will be given a small ceremonial role with no real power. You will, in essence, be retired. He paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. My father's face cycled through a series of emotions. Rage, disbelief, and finally, dawning horror. Option 2, my grandfather continued, his voice hardening, is that I do nothing. I let the company collapse under the weight of your debt and incompetence. And then I will hand over every piece of evidence we have, the financial records, Ms. Chen's testimony about your legal inquiries, the recording of James's phone call, to the district attorney and to every newspaper in this state. You will be publicly ruined, and you will likely face criminal charges for conspiracy to commit fraud against the elderly. My father's face, which had been red with anger, drained of all color. He understood. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a surrender, and my grandfather was dictating the terms. You have until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning to have your lawyer contact Ms. Chun with your decision, William concluded. He then stood up, a clear dismissal. Now, get out of my house. They left without another word. There were no apologies, no pleas, just the shuffling feet of defeated people, the sound echoing in the grand foyer. After they were gone, a profound quiet settled over the house. The adrenaline that had been coursing through my veins for hours began to fade, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. You did well, Ethan, my grandfather said, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. You used your mind, not just your anger. That's strength. The next day was for tying up loose ends. My father, as expected, chose option 1. The lawyers began the process of transferring control. The empire he had built on a foundation of sand was being handed over to be rebuilt on solid rock. Then I made one last call. I met Megan at the same coffee shop where she had tried to manipulate me. She was waiting, a hopeful, nervous smile on her face, likely thinking I was there to continue our alliance. I didn't say a word. I just placed my phone on the table between us and pressed play. It was a recording of my conversation with her, the one where she'd laid out her plan to get close to me, the one where she admitted James was in deep with gambling debts and that my parents had taken out a second mortgage on their house. I had called her back after the family meeting, pretending to be distraught and confused, and she had eagerly spilled every last secret, thinking she was winning me over. Her face went ashen as she listened to her own voice, her own betrayal. The mask of the concerned girlfriend melted away, revealing the terrified gold digger beneath. I know everything, I said quietly when it was over. I know James is in debt. I know you were his last-ditch effort to get to my grandfather's money. I stood up, leaving the coffee I'd ordered untouched. Stay away from James. Stay away from my family. If I ever see or hear from you again, this recording goes public. I walked out, leaving her there with the bill and the ruins of her pathetic scheme. That evening, I had one final conversation with my parents. They called, their voices subdued, broken. They tried to apologize, but their words were hollow, filled with self-pity rather than genuine remorse. We never meant to hurt you, my mother cried. We just loved James so much, and he needed our help. The excuse was so pathetic, so revealing, that it didn't even anger me anymore. I listened, and then I delivered my own terms. I don't want your apologies, I said, my voice devoid of emotion. I don't want your excuses. What I want is for you to understand this. The relationship we had is over. It's gone. You destroyed it. From this point forward, if we need to communicate, it will be through our lawyers. Do not call me. Do not text me. Do not come to my home. We are done. Ethan, you can't mean that. My father pleaded, his voice cracking. We're your family. A family doesn't do what you did, I replied, and for the first time, I believed it with every fiber of my being. I hung up the phone before they could reply. It wasn't an act of anger. It was an act of self-preservation. It was the final, necessary amputation to save my own life. The storm was over. The waters were calm. And for the first time, I was the captain of my own ship, sailing into a future I would build for myself. A year can feel like a lifetime. The person I was, the quiet, insecure boy hoping for a scrap of approval from his family, felt like a stranger from a distant past. The year that followed the confrontation was not one of flashy victories or dramatic revenge. It was a year of quiet, methodical work. It was a year of building. True to his word, my grandfather established the trust and a new board took over my father's company. I wasn't handed a corner office and a fancy title. My grandfather wouldn't allow it. You don't get respect by title, Ethan, he told me, looking at me over the rim of his reading glasses. You earn it in the trenches. People will be watching you, waiting for you to fail. Don't give them the satisfaction. So I started as a senior financial analyst. My desk was in a cubicle on the 3rd floor, same as everyone else. My job was to pore over the wreckage of my father's deals, to find what was salvageable, what could be restructured, what had to be cut loose. It was grueling, unglamorous work. I was the first one in the office, my coffee cup in hand as the sun rose, and often the last one to leave, the city lights twinkling outside my window. Some of the older employees, loyal to my father, looked at me with suspicion, with resentment. They saw a usurper, the grandson who had stolen the company. They'd fall silent when I walked into the break room. They'd leave me off of email chains. I didn't try to win them over with words or false bonhomie. I did it with my work. I built financial models that were more accurate than any they had seen. I found efficiencies they had overlooked for years. I identified a small, undervalued commercial property in their portfolio that everyone had written off as a lost cause. I spent weeks on it, my own secret project. I visited the site on weekends. I researched zoning laws. I talked to local business owners. I developed a comprehensive plan to rezone, refurbish, and lease the property to a growing tech startup. I presented my proposal to the new board, my voice steady, my data irrefutable. I anticipated every question, every objection. One of the board members, a grizzled veteran of the industry named Henderson, who had been one of my father's biggest critics, grilled me for 20 minutes. He picked at every assumption, every projection. I stood my ground, defending my numbers with calm logic. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and a slow smile spread across his face. "The kid's got guts," he said to the rest of the board. "And he's done his homework." The board approved it unanimously. It was my first real victory, earned not by birthright, but by merit. The whispers in the office began to change. The suspicion was replaced by a grudging respect. A few of the senior guys started stopping by my cubicle to ask my opinion on their own projects. I was no longer just the owner's grandson. I was Ethan, the guy who knew his numbers. My father was a ghost in the company. He kept his title, his office, but he had no authority. I would see him sometimes in the hallways. He looked older, smaller. The arrogant bluster was gone, replaced by a weary resignation. We would nod, a curt, professional acknowledgement, and keep walking. There was nothing left to say. My mother retreated into her world of design, focusing on charity events and garden clubs, maintaining the facade of a perfect life even as the foundation had crumbled. James disappeared. I heard through the grapevine that he'd moved to a different state, taking a low-level sales job selling industrial cleaning supplies. He was finally forced to stand on his own 2 feet, and he was finding the ground unsteady. My personal life was also being rebuilt, but on a foundation of trust, not obligation. Sophia was my rock. She had been there through the worst of it, not as a savior, but as a partner. She listened when I needed to vent, celebrated my small victories, and was brutally honest when I needed to hear it. "Stop obsessing over what they think," she'd tell me, swatting my arm as we walked through the park. "They don't get to live in your head rent-free anymore." Our friendship, forged in the fires of that crisis, slowly, naturally, blossomed into something more. It started with late-night talks that turned into dinner dates, which turned into weekend trips. It was a quiet, comfortable love, free of drama and manipulation. It was real. Professor Martinez became a lifelong mentor, connecting me with his network of alumni, opening doors I never could have on my own. My circle of friends, the ones who had shown up at the lake house, became my chosen family. We had barbecues, went to games, celebrated holidays. It was a family bound by loyalty, not by blood. One evening, about a year after the confrontation, my phone rang. It was an unknown number, but I answered it. "Ethan?" The voice was hesitant, familiar. It was my Aunt Rebecca, my mother's sister. In all the years of family gatherings, she had always been kind but distant, a neutral party in the family's Cold War. "Hi, Aunt Rebecca," I said, cautious, my guard immediately up. I know it's been a while," she stammered. "And I know you probably don't want to hear from any of us. I get it. I wanted to call and say, I'm sorry." I waited, not sure what to say. "For all of it," she continued, her voice gaining a bit of strength, as if a weight was being lifted from her. "For years, I watched how they treated you, how they put James on a pedestal and acted like you were invisible. It was wrong. I was a coward for not saying anything, for not standing up for you. I was afraid of your father, of your mother's disapproval. But that's no excuse. I want you to know that I always saw you. I always saw how special you were. And I am so proud of the man you've become." Tears welled in my eyes. It was an unexpected gift, a piece of my old family reaching out, not to ask for something, but to give. It didn't erase the pain, but it soothed a wound I didn't know was still so raw. "Thank you, Aunt Rebecca," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "That means more than you know." It was a small connection, a fragile bridge back to a part of my past. It didn't mean forgiveness for my parents. It didn't mean I would let them back into my life. But it was a reminder that not everything from my old life was broken beyond repair. It was a glimmer of hope. It was a new dawn, and for the first time, I was looking towards the horizon, not back at the shadows. I had received an invitation to James's wedding a few weeks prior. I'd thrown it in the trash without a second thought. My future was my own, and it had no room for the ghosts of the past. 2 years after that fateful summer, I found myself sitting in a crowded auditorium, wearing another cap and gown. This time it was for my master's degree in finance. The air was filled with the buzz of excitement, the murmur of proud families, the flash of cameras. As the dean droned on from the podium, I scanned the crowd. It was a reflex, a ghost of a habit. For a split second, I looked for my parents' faces, for the familiar figures who were supposed to be there. But the habit died as quickly as it arose. I wasn't looking for them. I didn't need them to be there. My eyes found who I was actually looking for. In the third row, my grandfather sat, straight and proud, his weathered face beaming. Next to him, Sophia squeezed his arm, her smile so bright it could have lit up the entire room. Beside her were Derek and a few other friends, who gave me a ridiculous thumbs up when they caught my eye. This was my family. The ones who showed up. The ones who celebrated my victories because they were my victories, not because it reflected well on them. When my name was called, Ethan Hayes, Master of Science in Finance with distinction, the applause from that small section of the crowd was the loudest in the building. As I walked across the stage and shook the dean's hand, I didn't feel the echo of past slights or the shadow of my brother. I felt only a profound sense of peace. I had done this. Every late night studying, every complex problem solved, every bit of success I had achieved in the past 2 years. It was all mine. Later that day, we didn't have a massive, catered affair. We had a simple barbecue on the deck of my grandfather's lake house, the same deck where he had thrown me the party that started it all. We grilled burgers, drank cheap beer, and laughed until our sides hurt. At sunset, I stood by the edge of the water, looking at my reflection. The face staring back at me was different. The uncertainty was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence. The hunger for approval had vanished, replaced by a calm self-assurance. The recognition I had craved from my parents for so long, I realized, had been a cage. Their approval was conditional, a prize I could never quite win because the game was always rigged. By withholding it, they had inadvertently given me the greatest gift of all, the motivation to find my own worth, to define my own success. I was no longer the forgotten son, the lesser brother. I was just Ethan, a man who had faced betrayal and found his strength, a man who had lost a family and built a better one, a man who was finally completely free. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it resonated with you in some way. It's a strange thing, family. Sometimes the people who are supposed to lift you up are the ones holding you down. Have you ever had to make the difficult choice to walk away to save yourself? Share your story in the comments below. I read them all. And don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next.